I did a lot of research when it came on to this specific topic about like Darth Vader being reincarnated or something. Well, I went into a lot of Star Wars lore, and I realized that this probably won't be the actual title anymore. What if Deku was Darth Vader's reincarnation? I'm probably going to rename it What if Deku was Anakin's reincarnation? I think this would be a more accurate title, and that's why you guys are seeing this instead of Darth Vader, especially with how I scripted this and everything. But yeah, Anakin Skywalker had made many mistakes throughout his life. Honestly, very regrettable mistakes. Some that he wished that he could go back and change, but he knew that it was already too late. At the very least, he managed to at least get to see his kids. He managed to see them for one last time. He knew that some of them, they may never forgive him for his actions, or at least one of them. But he did have at least one joy in his life. That was to be able to see them. To see what could have been. He wished every day that he had never been tempted by the dark side, that he were to never have been manipulated the way he was, the fact that he was so gullible, that he never listened to Obi-Wan. All of his actions were made off of impulse. He wondered what life would be like if he had never made such mistakes, if he had never decided to join Palpatine, if he had never decided to shed himself of his former life to become Darth Vader. He wondered. One day, he wouldn't open his eyes though, in order to see that he was in a strange place. He had been so used to being part of the Force, being a Force ghost, that this seemed surreal to him. He looked around and he felt very small for some reason, very light and heavy at the same time. He tried to stretch out his hands, but for some strange reason, they were small, so tiny and plump looking. He was even more confused. That was until two people walked into the room, and they looked very different. They looked so big to him. Were they giants or something? This made him even more confused, and he began to even try to utter words, asking what's going on here. But instead of actual words coming out of his mouth, a bunch of gibberish came out. And that's when he realized he had been reborn. DJ Izuku's parents were able to recognize that their baby boy, he was different from other kids his age. He was intelligent and strong, but he was kinda distant towards others. It wasn't necessarily Izuku's fault though. You see, the way he saw it, all of his quote-unquote peers, they were just, how could you describe it, maybe incompetent fools. You see, in one of his old lives, he had been a respected and feared figure of an intergalactic empire. In another life, he had been a feared Jedi. He was well respected. He was strong, he was powerful, he was capable of many things as a Jedi and many things as a Sith. People knew he was strong. Few would ever have the audacity to dare test him. Those that did, of course, they suffered severe consequences. But, especially during his time as a Sith, he had been severely manipulated during that time. He wanted to make a change in this world. He was given a second chance at life, and he refused to let it be a repeat of last time. He refused to let this second chance at life be a waste. Allow him to just repeat his actions from back then. That was going to be such a ridiculous thing to do. Especially in this world. You see, this world was ruled by these powers called quirks, apparently. And it just so happened that he was born quirkless. He didn't seem to really care that much, though. His mother sure did, though. He was even picked on in school for that, but he didn't let this really bother him. His first instinct was, well, to show dominance, but he would pause. He contemplated his actions here, his options, before actually deciding to, well, let these kids talk. He wouldn't let their comments bother him. After all, these were just words. It wasn't as if they were actually harming him. He knew that he could accomplish more than the people who could pull their eyes out of their eye sockets anyways. The comments would eventually die down when the kids realized that their bullying didn't really seem to faze Izuku that much as they hoped anyways. Among his classmates though, there would be one boy who would continuously be a bit of a burden to Izuku though. You see, his name was Bakugo Katsuki, or Katsuki Bakugo, however you pronounce it or say it. Most kids, they saw him as the top dog in the school. He was a bully, and the teachers, they practically kissed the ground that he walked on, since he was gifted with a powerful quirk. And especially out of all the kids that he bullied, Izuku was probably one of his most frequent. Izuku, he would do his best to not let Bakugo bother him, but everyone had their breaking point, no matter how patient they were, and Izuku already wasn't particularly the most patient kid out there, even during his time as Anakin. He was a bit of a hothead, you could say. When they were 8 years old, Bakugo and his goons, they would have found that picking on a kid with a weak ice quirk was rather enjoyable for some reason. I mean, the kid could literally only make ice cubes and that's it. The amount of jokes that they could make on this kid was endless. It was found to be pretty worthless of a quirk after all. Izuku initially wanted to ignore this. After all, it wasn't necessarily his problem. He would walk away from the scene only to find himself coming right back, annoyed at the fact that he promised himself to become a better person in this world. He would call out Bakugo and his goons, telling them to knock it off. Bakugo, he would advise Izuku to be quiet though, lest he wished to end up in the same situation as this kid. Izuku, he didn't listen though. Up until this point, Bakugo, he had technically never put his hands on Izuku, simply threaten him and verbally attack him. But Here was the thing. He had a very limited vocabulary, so that didn't really even phase Izuku all that much. At most, Bakugo would just call him stupid and weak, quirkless. That was about it. Even if he was smart, he was still a kid with a kid's brain. Izuku, on the other hand, he had years of experience behind this brain of his. He had a far larger range of words to use. He even had words that weren't even from this planet that he could technically use on Bakugo. But he wouldn't really get it, and he didn't really see the point of, well, attacking a kid either. Well, up until this point anyways. Yeah, you see, the blonde and his goons, they would attempt to actually gang up on Izuku, but this was when his years of combat would actually kick in. Almost like instinct, Izuku would dodge Bakugo's explosions and elbow him in like the gut. He would also elbow the goon with wings, and he would pick up a stick and use it to bash the goon that could stretch their fingers in the face. Their attacks were so wired and telegraphed that it didn't even feel like sparring to Izuku. Izuku would be quick on his feet, leaving everyone who witnessed the event in shock. They never expected him to be able to fight like that. Izuku would be confused at the stares that he was getting though. Bakugo, he would try to launch another attack at Izuku, but the boy would just redirect it. Bakugo would be stunned until Izuku ended the fight by whacking him with the stick. Despite everyone being aghast at what happened, Izuku would not pay anyone any sort of mind. Instead, he would just walk up to the kid he was trying to protect and stretch out his hand, asking if they were alright. He did not get a response though. Well, at least he was not getting the response that he was expecting. Instead of gratefulness for his deed, the kid seemed scared of him. How odd. With all of the commotion over the incident, teachers would find themselves getting involved. Izuku would be sent to the principal's office after this, and Izuku would try to defend his actions earnestly. In the end though, he got suspended for 2 days. Naturally, his mother was furious over what happened until she found out what he got suspended for. She honestly had a very hard time believing that her quirkless son would get into a fight against 3 quirk users, or get into a fight to even begin with, let alone beat all 3 of them up. It just sounded so surreal to Inko, but the principal confirmed it, and there were apparently witnesses as well, so she had no choice but to accept it. She didn't even bother grounding Izuku, she was just that much in shock. Well, he also told her that he only fought the boys because they were bullying a kid and he was simply trying to protect them. So yeah, that was another reason why he didn't get grounded. Instead, she just decided to give him a talk in order to make sure he avoided getting into a ton of conflict in the future. Izuku, he would promise to at least not go searching for fights, and to, well, use his words more in order to diffuse a potential confrontation. He would specifically avoid using his fists as much when fighting. The phrasing was a bit weird to his mother, but she was willing to accept it. Izuku knew exactly what he meant by phrasing the question that way though. In that fight against Bakugo and his goons, he felt a familiar sensation. The Force. Yes. It was still there. He had his suspicions, but that fight confirmed it. Even in this new body, he still had a bit of a connection to the Force. Maybe weakened, but a connection nonetheless. He could work with that. He would work on building back up his skills with the Force in secret. He wanted to surprise his mother one day. She had a quirk that resembled one of the aspects of the Force, albeit to a minuscule level. He'd be lying to her, sure, but he figured she'd be ecstatic seeing him having inherited what she could only assume to be her quirk. Not only that, but to have it be in an evolved form as well? He noticed a trend with parents over the years. A lot of them prided themselves over the fact their kids inherited an ability resembling their own. He could only assume it was like how a parent bragged about how their kid looked like them. He never really got a chance to experience that in his old life. At one point, he thought his kids and his wife were dead. At one point, he was forced to fight and potentially kill them. That was in the past though. It took him almost a decade, self-taught, but he eventually brought himself back to a certain mastery of the Force. It was more difficult with how he tried to avoid tapping into the dark side, and he would be lying if he said it wasn't tempting at times to just go back to using the dark side, especially with how long he had been accustomed to it when he was Darth Vader at the very least. His memories of his time under Palpatine, the constant pain and suffering he was under, and the countless amount of regrets he had from falling for the temptations of the dark side were what fueled him to avoid it though. It was worth it in the end, and by the time he was 14, he had become proficient enough in the Force that he could use it in combat. His only issue now was actually having a lightsaber to go along with his fighting style. While he was stuck in that mechanical suit of his that served as life support, his movements they had been slowed down tremendously. He was no longer able to move like Anakin once was with his lightsaber. He would get overwhelmed in combat sometimes, and sometimes because of that, at least as Darth Vader. And eventually, he found himself using the Force plenty more in combat in order to gain the edge against his opponents. That, and he used more precise attacks as well, more heavy-handed attacks from the lightsaber. He imagined that would be what he would have to do here as well until he could meet someone with an analytical enough mind to construct one for him. He doubted that he would ever find one here, but he also doubted that he would ever get a second chance at life. So, you couldn't say that it was impossible or wasn't impossible. He wasn't exactly sure. Still, he did have his doubts. He could maybe find one that could construct a lightsaber for him in the future if he were to attend one of these hero schools. Maybe. They seem somewhat similar to a Jedi in terms of trying to keep balance and retain a sense of order in society. He figured that this was a force nudging him in the right direction. He wouldn't ignore it like last time. His goal was to make it into the top hero school in Japan, UA High School. He wasn't expecting for his teacher to make this public knowledge at school one day though. You see, at first during homeroom their teacher came in explaining how everyone ought to take their futures well very, very seriously in terms of what they wanted to be. He had a bunch of career aptitude test papers in hand, but he found himself throwing them into the air without a care in the world about the mess that he was making. He explained that he knew everyone in this room, they wanted to become heroes. Bakugo hollered about how everyone in the room though was going to just be a bunch of D-lister heroes' sidekicks. At best. Many would be annoyed at Bakugo's rude comment. But they would quiet down when the teacher revealed that the blonde apparently planned on registering to go to UA. They couldn't deny that the blonde had power. Out of everyone here, he probably had the most powerful quirk and could become a great hero one day if he fixes attitude. Bakugo quickly claimed that he would be the only one out of this rundown school to make it into UA and eventually become the #1 hero, being even more famous and powerful than All Might. To this, the teacher would just mention how, another student planned to attend UA. That student being Izuku, who was in the back, minding his own business. His head perked up when he heard his name be mentioned. Many of the kids would begin to whisper at the practicality of Izuku trying to make it into UA. After all, he didn't have a quirk, right? Someone mentioned how he took down Bakugo and his goons when they tried to gang up on him before. Others would criticize such statements, so bringing up how that was like 6 years ago and it was probably a stroke of luck at best. Bakugo would be angered at the fact that Izuku essentially stole his thunder and stomped over to his desk. He would try to slam his hand onto Izuku's desk and set off a couple of explosions in order to intimidate the green-headed boy. But Izuku, he would just grab onto the blonde's wrist and point it upwards. The explosion would set off in Bakugo's face, causing for the class to laugh a bit until they saw fury in his eyes. Bakugo saw nothing but red in this moment. He wanted to attack Izuku and show him just where he really stood on the totem pole. He seemed to have gotten cocky over the years from that one fight they had as kids. He should have humbled him way earlier on. He was about to set off another explosion, but the teacher would warn Bakugo that any sense of violence, especially with the use of your quirk, could be range for suspension or worse, expulsion. Bakugo, he would back down begrudgingly and return to his seat. After school, Izuku would be in the middle of packing up when Bakugo and his goons decided to try cornering him again, just like 6 years ago. In response, Izuku would decide to give them a little taste of the Force. He didn't plan on using any serious moves or anything, no. Rather, he simply used a Jedi mind trick in order to place a suggestion into the minds of the trio. He was able to convince them to let him go, but it didn't seem to last as long on Bakugo. By the time he left the room, he immediately heard Bakugo's overbearing voice yell in fury at his goons on letting Izuku go. Izuku would simply chuckle as he rushed out of the school, not wanting to have an altercation with the blonde right now. He could hear their footsteps, but he would shake them off by cutting through an alley. He eventually found himself walking through a tunnel in order to get home, but found himself having to deal with a person made out of sludge. They claimed to want to escape from All Might and planned to use Izuku as a meat suit. He was disgusted hearing that, in all honesty. From his understanding, this guy was a criminal that ought to be dealt with. He had no issues using the telekinetic side of the Force in order to suppress the villain. Originally, the sludge villain launched himself towards Izuku, but found his body being manipulated and compressed against his will. He screamed in terror as his body was turned into a small ball of sludge, before being placed in one of the empty bottles around the area. Izuku sealed the cap tight, so the villain wouldn't be able to escape and planned on turning him into the police. But just then, Izuku would hear some rattling coming from the sewers, and he initially thought that this was another villain that he had to, worry about. To his surprise though, that wasn't the case. No. It was actually the exact opposite. It was a hero that came from out of the sewers. Not just any hero either, but the number one hero, All Might. The two would introduce themselves to each other, and Izuku would explain what happened to the hero. All Might would be impressed that Izuku could easily defend himself against a villain. He would warn him not to use his quirk outside of self-defense though, since that would technically be considered a crime. Izuku would nod in understanding, even though he found it to be slightly dumb, the restrictions given on quirk usage in this world. All Might would ask if Izuku was planning on becoming a hero, to which the boy would say yes to. He'd question where the boy wanted to go, and when finding out it was UA, All Might would actually let Izuku in on a secret. You see, he planned on teaching there soon and hoped to see him there. He'd give Izuku his autograph and take the villain off the boy's hands, leaping out of the tunnel. Izuku would decide to leave the tunnel afterwards, having a bit of a smile on his face. Gaining the number one hero's acknowledgement meant that all he was doing to become a better person wasn't all for naught. Any doubt he may have had in his mind throughout the years was practically gone now. He was even more encouraged to try out for UA now. The next 10 months would be spent refining his control in the force to use in combat. He found himself practicing his control via creating constructs from the junk scattered around when in the beaches. He'd use the junk as projectiles at times as well. The 10 months would go by in a flash, and Izuku felt that he was ready after that point. He was confident that he would be able to pass the entrance exams. His confidence would actually skyrocket during this time. He would practically be exuding confidence as he walked into UA's testing grounds. Some of the students saw this as him being overconfident, but Izuku knew his capabilities. When they found out from their testing operator, President Mike, what the physical test was going to be, this only made Izuku's confidence grow even more, to the point where it was overwhelming, overbearing to some, and the written exam did not really help to lower his confidence either. You see, he felt that the written exam wasn't really all that hard, fairly easy actually, to the point where a toddler can probably get this, but then again, he did have the mind of an adult, and he was used to literally being part of an intergalactic empire. Yeah, so what he considered to be easy might not be the equivalent for others. When it came into the physical part though, this was going to be a piece of cake to Izuku. As soon as President Mike gave the green light for the kids to enter into the city grounds where the robots were, Izuku would immediately rush in. Most of the other kids were still stunned, expecting for there to have been a countdown to switch, but no. It was only when President Mike told them to follow after Izuku's lead, mentioning how there were no countdowns in real life combat, did the rest finally get their heads in the game. Izuku was already way ahead of most of the competitors though. He would have used the force in order to rip apart certain parts of the robots and use them as projectiles. He even found himself flying on some of the projectiles and punching a hole in others after physically enhancing himself via the force. The instructors watching Izuku's performance would be amazed. They figured that he had a strong form of telekinesis to do all that he had done so far. When it came on to punching a hole in some of the robots, they figured out, oh, he just had an extremely refined control over his telekinetic abilities to the point that he could literally encase himself in his telekinesis and physically enhance his body. They went completely wrong, and to their credit, Even Izuku listed his quirk as telekinesis too. They eventually decided to release the Zero Pointer in order to see how the students would react to such a challenge. As they predicted, many ran away from the obstacle. Izuku considered running away as well, since he already obtained enough points to pass. He paused though when he heard a girl crying out for help. He turned around to see a girl who had a leg trapped under some rubble. The Zero Pointer was quickly approaching too. Izuku decided to use the force in order to lift the rubble off of the girl and rush over to pick her up in his arms. It wasn't the most impressive display of power so far, but it didn't need to really show off all the time either. As long as it got the job done, that was all that mattered at the end of the day, right? In the end, Izuku would have won first place in overall points though. He would have found this out from the acceptance letter he received a couple weeks after the exam, and his heart began to race after the news. This new chapter of his life was just beginning. He had no idea what was going to be in store for him and the others in the future.